Good day, everyone. I am Likely Andal,
I am Annalie Valiente. I'm Wendell Silla.
and we are going to tackle the acculturation model. But before we go to our main discussion, let us have first our guide questions. This will be the questions up for the discussion. The first one is how does this theory or these theories relate to your own second language acquisition? The second is what are the strengths and weaknesses of the theories presented? And the last one is how will these theories aid you to become a better language learners, specifically in a second language teaching setting? As we go through our discussion, I hope you will have answers to these questions. So let's go first in acculturation theory. Next. Acculturation focuses on the sociocultural factors of language teaching and learning. So this is basically just factors that are affecting second language acquisition. So we have first the social factors in the acculturation model. This social factor has a premise that says the greater the social distance between the second language learners and the target language, the more difficult it is for the second language learners to learn the target language. So basically, if it has a big distance from the group of second language learners and the target language group, it's the more harder it is for them to learn the target language. So what are these social factors? So the first social factors that affecting second language acquisition, next, next, next slide. So the first social factors that affecting second language acquisition is the social dominance pattern, and the social dominance pattern tell us if the second language learner group is politically, culturally, technically, or economically superior than the target language group, they will tend not to learn the target language. I think this is also in connection with the politics of second language teaching. If you feel, let's say, for example, for Americans, if they're trying to learn Filipino, they will have hesitancy in learning Filipino because, of course, Americans think they are politically, culturally more superior than us. So the first factor affecting second language. The next factor is the integration strategy. We have these three integration strategies. We have assimilation, preservation, and acculturation. So in assimilation, you totally give up your first language to second language, which while preservation is the entire opposite. You maintain your first language no matter how hard it is for the teacher to teach your second language. You keep on maintaining the first language. And the number three is acculturation. It is the compromise between language 1 and language 2. The acculturation model is a meeting together in the middle between language 1 and language 2. What do you think is the best strategy in the integration of language learning? It is assimilation, preservation, or acculturation. Let's try to rank them from 1 to 3, from 1 being the most effective way of second language learning to the least effective. So which one do you think is the best way to learn a language?
Assimilation, acculturation, and nativization.
Okay, your answer is correct. According to Schumann, the proponent of this theory is that assimilation leads to maximum contact between the second language learners and the target language, but acculturation can also provide a few contexts but not as much as the context of assimilation. And then, of course, number three will be preservation because there's resistancy in language learning. The third factor is enclosure. The enclosure means the amount of sharing of social construct that the second language learner groups enjoys with the target language group. It's like this. Why do you think we learn English much better than other languages? Because we share a good number of social constructs, like let's say, for example, the church. We have the church that we compare from Hinduism. We do not share the same construct. Another example is a family. If we have the same social constructs, according to enclosure, it's easier for us to learn the target language. If we share the same social constructs such as school, church, recreational facilities, and activities, professions, and trades, the better it is for us to learn the target language. Next. And the fourth one would be cohesiveness and size of the second language group. So the cohesiveness is the closeness. If you are close with your group, there is a social distance to your target language. So again, if you are a group of learners and then you are close, it does not give you any opportunity to interact with the target language. That's closeness of group plus if your group is large is equal to greater social distance to target language group. The next one is congruency and similarity. So what does it mean? It means that the lifestyle and the value system of the second language and the target language group. I think for me, it's just the same with number three of or the enclosure. If they have the same lifestyle or value system, the more we are receptive to learn the second language. So that includes the language family as well, but that's more on the linguistic part. The next is social factor or attitude. Language learning is easier if members of the second language learner group hold positive ethnic stereotypes about the target language group. For us, Filipino, we think Americans are superior. Americans are much better, so we try to hold these positive ethnic stereotypes about them, and it makes us easy to learn English because of that stereotype of the Americans. Okay, the next one. Next slide, please. The next one is the intended length of residency. So if the second language learners intends to stay longer, the target language area will reduce social distance and ameliorate or improve motivation. So if you intend to stay longer, let's just say for example, it's the immigrants from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, those countries in the Western Asia, so if they intend to stay in the North America longer, they will really have that huge motivation to learn the language. And that's kind of the social factors.
So let's go to the affecting factors affecting to the acculturation model. First is the language shock. So learners fears that he will appear comic when he tries to speak the target language. If the learner has this is the language shock. And it hinders English language learning or the second language acquisition. The next one, aside from language shock is the culture shock. So it is anxiety resulting from disorientation encountered upon entering a new culture. You had the ability to cope with the problems you had here in the Philippines. But when you go there, it's different thing. What works here in the Philippines does not work there, especially human problem solving. They call this problem solving mechanism, so they do not work anymore in there, but they work here, so that's one reason of the culture shock. Next one is motivation. Learners' reason for trying to learn the target language, and of course, there's integrative and instrumental motivation. Integrative is you use it for your daily life, and for instrumental just for classroom usage. Next. And lastly is effective factor is ego permeability. So when inhibition is lowered, ego permeability is enhanced, resulting in ability to learn target language well.
Okay lang yung tayo.
According to Freiland, concept of ego, so once you build your ego, your language learning become reject your language learning. So it's common said, if your inhibition is lowered your ego, permeability is enhanced. That means you are able to adjust to new language rules that are introduced to you in the second language, resulting in the ability to learn the target language well. Okay, let's go to the implications of the acculturation model theory. So the first is the practice of items or instructional materials for use in Southeast Asian schools. Should cease before, I don't know if it's still happening today because we are already have good publishers here in the Philippines. But before, especially during the American time, they import their textbooks from the US and then transfer it here, they brought it together. With the thumb size, they brought their textbooks here, and that's the started of us importing authentic language materials. But these items are not prepared for a particular social environment or a social environment like ours because they have different environment and it's also different from ours. So that's one implication of this theory. The second one is functional use of language should develop not only one's linguistics competence but also one's communicative competence. You can see the linguistic competence in each factors there. There is no indication competence and it's all about communicative competence, how you are interact with a target language group. So it will not have urge. It's not the same important in traditional theories. This theory because it's not only linguistic competence but also communicative competence. And lastly, instructional materials should reflect the functions of the different speech varieties and the communities. So that's mean that the different rules in the community, the items should reflect it. Nativization model. Now, let's go to the next theory, which is the nativization theory by Roger Anderson. Now, this theory sought to explain how learners create and recognize their IL system verbally when interacting with more proficient speakers. So this theory is more on the development of IL and of course, as what Sergeant said, the bridge between our language 1 and our proficiency in our language 2. When we acquire a second language in the early stages, we tend to speak it in the same way. We normally speak our first language. Sometimes we just don't know the rules of our target language. So when we acquire a second language in the early stages, we tend to speak it in the same way. We normally speak our first language. Sometimes we just didn't know the rules of our target language. So we rely in our first language system and try to speak the second language in the system of our first language. Therefore, we simplify the target language using our first language system or prior knowledge we have in order to speak it. In early stages of our language acquisition, the nativization happens. This is where we almost, if not completely, use the rules, grammars, and system, and even the accent of our second language instead of simplifying the second language using our first language. We use inference, and strategies to successfully speak the target language. Now, we should move on to the features and examples of this theory. The nativization model has two features, are also known as two general processes, namely nativization and denativization. In nativization, this happens necessarily when a second language used by adult parents becomes a native language of their children. Nativization has been a particular interest to linguists and to prioritize more specifically where the second language concerned is pidgin in nativization learners based on their second language inference on their first language. It is characterized by assimilation, in which in order to learn the second language and learners give up his/her knowledge in his or her first language. It is triggered when users in a second language environment inevitably mode the language to express the facts and concepts relevant to their own particular context. While in denativization, it involves accommodation, which refers to the process by which participants in a conversation adjust their accent, direction, and other aspects of language according to the speech style of other participants. In this process, the learner adjusts his or her internalized system to make it fit with the input. The learner uses inference strategies to reshape his or her interlanguage according for an external norm. It is construction of grammar based in the form specified by the input. An example is there are two children, the boy speaks Cebuano while the girl speaks Tagalog. As she was from Manila, the boy told her, Ali, meaning comes here, and she understood it based on the gesture of the boy. However, when the boy informed her that there is a langgam, the girl automatically inferred this in her head using her first language, which is Tagalog, as she was still in the process of learning, and the second language, which is Cebuano. In her language, langgam means ants. That's why she started scratching her feet, but turns out the langgam that the boy is talking about is a bird. This is an example of nativization. This is very common when it comes to the early stages of second language acquisition. Anderson said, second language acquisition is the gradual transition of attention from an internal to an external norm. The switch that learners make from reliance on simplifying to reliance on inferencing strategies. And of course, the strategy that I talk about, the simplification, is the building of hypotheses based on her knowledge of language one. Now, the learner will make a switch to inferencing strategies. So now let's move on to the differences of acculturation and nativization. The acculturation and nativist models focus on the power mechanisms of second language acquisition. They provide explanation of why language 2 learners, unlike first language learners, often fail to achieve a native-like competence. The acculturation model is a theory proposed by Janice Kaman in second language acquisition to describe the acquisition of second language 2. By members of ethnic minorities who often include immigrants, migrant workers, or their children. Acculturation is the process of learning to live successfully in different cultures, as well as the process of assisting others in doing so. In the other words, it refers to the process of assimilation of digestion in different cultures, usually the dominant one. Acculturation is a highly variable process for both the cultural groups in contact and for the individual members. It is also a complex situation for spouses and for parents, their children. While nativization is to explain how learners create or recognize their IL system verbally when interacting with more proficient speakers. So now, the similarities of acculturation and nativist. The acculturation and nativist model focus on the power mechanism of second language acquisition. They provide explanations of Why language 2 learners, unlike first language learners, often fail to achieve a native-like competence? 갑니다.